Hey y'all, Max here, and welcome back to episode 3 of Nihon no Kounyo Shukai. We previously talked about the Famicom in the first episode. The Famicom would end up being the NES, and Nintendo rode the NES's success for quite some time. But in 1989, Sega released the Genesis, also known as the Mega Drive in Japan. And the Genesis made a pretty big impact and took some of Nintendo's market share in the video game market. So, in response, in holiday 1990, Nintendo released the successor to the Famicom, which was the Super Famicom. And it was then released in North America as the Super Nintendo, or SNES. So, the biggest change from the NES to Super Nintendo is that the NES used 8-bit graphics, which meant that only a certain number of colors were able to fill in pictures. And on the Super Nintendo, you were able to get 16-bit graphics, which is way more color channels available. So right away, pictures looked way better on the Super Nintendo than they did on the NES. And even today, even if the Super Nintendo wasn't quite as impactful as the NES, we still feel it's what it brought to the table, because so many games today are still made in like 16-bit style, kind of as a homage to the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom. So the games that Nintendo put out on the Super Nintendo were fantastic. One of the games that really brought Nintendo back up to speed with Sega was Donkey Kong Country, and this is what carts look like here in North America. So this is going to be very different from the Super Famicom games we're about to talk about, but the point I'm trying to make here is that the Super Nintendo is region locked, so you can't play Super Famicom games in a Super Nintendo and vice versa. But playing Super Famicom games here in North America is super easy, because inside a Super Nintendo, there are little tabs inside the cartridge port. You can literally snap off with a pair of pliers and play games that way. Going the opposite direction, Super Famicom playing SNES games, a little bit different, because the Super Famicom has a rounded cartridge port, so the games don't fit as neatly. But in a lot of cases, most people that have Super Famicoms aren't trying to play Super Nintendo games, because they got it on Super Famicom. So we got a couple Super Famicom games to talk about today, and let's get right into it. So the first one is that first game I showed, Air Management Ozora ni Kakeru, better known as Aerobiz here in North America. It is a 1992 business sim developed and published by Koei. So there are two modes. The first one begins in 1963 and the other one begins in 1983. And they have slightly different storylines just based on where the world was in 1963, 1983. But specifically, it's a business sim for airlines. So if you want to think about what airlines were like in 1963 versus 1983, that landscape was way different. And those are the two kind of storylines you could play. One thing that Aerobiz or Air Management have in common is that you can also play in multiplayer. So you can compete against AI computers that are trying to compete for the better airline, or you can play with a friend and just see who comes up with the better airline. So Air Management came to North America as Aerobiz in early 1993, and I initially bought it because I have this weird habit of buying Japanese games that kind of reference like North American culture, or American culture very specifically. We're going to see more of that in just a second. So when I saw Air Management, it looked like a super American game. So it's always interesting to play Japanese games that seem American, if that makes any sense. So that's why I bought it. It seems like a pretty neat game. So a game that I would actually try and not just collect. But going back to that idea of buying games that seem very American on Japanese systems, in the first episode we talked about American Odan Ultra Quiz, and now we have America Odan Ultra Quiz for the Super Famicom. So again, kind of going on that idea of American games on the Super Famicom or Japanese systems in general. This game's a little bit different. This is a 1992 quiz game developed by Genki and published by Tomy. But I couldn't find a lot of info about it. But what I was able to find was a Giant Bomb article that says it's based on the UK show Ultra Quiz, which is basically you have a ton of people to begin with. And as people are getting questions wrong in a trivia game, those people leave. So it's kind of just play as long as you can until either nobody's left or you get through the game and only a handful of people are left. What it most reminded me of which I don't know if anybody would remember this, is the game HQ that we used to play on our phones, like, is it 10 years ago at this point? Maybe? Like 5, 6, 7 years ago? I don't know if anybody remembers the game HQ, but it's kind of like that you start with all these people, but as people get questions wrong, people get eliminated. So that's what it is. The Famicom game was supposedly kind of like an RPG. This seems more just like a straight quiz game, but nonetheless, still pretty cool and still pretty funny. Next is Angelique. So this is a 1994 Otomi game developed by Ruby Party and published by Koei. So I had to do a little bit of research into this one, but Otomi games are basically dating sims made for women. And this is the first of its kind. So, and more or less popularized the Otomi genre. So it kickstarted an entire franchise about Angelique with manga, anime, and CDs. If you remember from previous episodes, a lot of these games started as mangas and then became video games, but this video game came first, and the rest of the franchise followed after that. So in this game, you play as Angelique, a high school girl who quests to become queen by winning over 9 guardians who are all of different elements and astrological signs. That's right. A character's astrological sign matters in this game. This game received a ton of different ports and updates, namely on the Saturn, PS1, Game Boy Advance, PSP, DS, Vita, and PC. So just seems like a kind of interesting game. Had no idea what it was when I bought it, but that's actually pretty historical. Next is Bahamut Lagoon. So this is a 1991 tactical RPG developed and published by Squaresoft, who would eventually become Square Enix after merging with Enix. You play as Captain Biu, raising an army of character squadrons and dragons to protect Kana, as it is invaded by the Gran Belos Empire. The only thing I thought in my head as I was researching this game was that it sounded so much like a D&D story. I've never played D&D in my life, but that's what it sounded like. The gameplay, it's 2D and grid and turn-based, and if there's any game that fits the mold of a Super Nintendo game, it was this one. It was eventually released on the Japanese Wii and Wii U Virtual Consoles, but it never got a release here in North America. I actually saw this game for the longest time at the game store, and I never bought it because I didn't know what it was, and it was kind of expensive. I didn't pay a lot for this, but that's kind of why I bought it. But it actually sounds like a pretty neat game, despite the fact I've never played D&D, and it sounds like a D&D game to me. So that's just kind of interesting. The next one is Bishoujo Senshi Sailor Moon S, Kondo wa Puzzle de Ashioki yo, or roughly translated as Sailor Moon S. This time it's Puzzle Punishment, which my understanding is in the Sailor Moon franchise, that's kind of Sailor Moon's catchphrase. I think I got that right. So Sailor Moon is a manga that began in 1991 about a middle school girl who, after becoming friends with a cat, transforms into Sailor Moon, who is a heroine that saves the world. Which I've seen Sailor Moon just in various places almost my entire life. I never knew what it was, never played it, never read it, nothing like that. But when I came across this game, I bought it because I was familiar with the character. Sailor Moon also became an anime and had movies, had a book series, had live action series, had more video games, and also, interestingly, I found that it also had other forms of media like theme park attractions and an ice skating show. That just seemed kind of funny to me. But my understanding is that Sailor Moon brought to life the heroine-dominated media, which seemed like a pretty big deal. I probably don't understand quite what that means, but my understanding is that Sailor Moon was a really big deal, especially when it first came out. So this game is a puzzle game. It's a 1994 Tetris-like game developed by Tom Create and published by Bandai, based on the Sailor Moon S season. So just kind of neat to get a game for a franchise I've seen before but didn't know anything about. So next, we talked in the first episode about the Tower of Druaga, which was the first game in a 3-part series that ends with the Blue Crystal Rod. So the Tower of Druaga is a Namco action maze RPG from 1984 that began what was called the Babylonian Castle Saga. The story becomes an RPG in 1986 with the return of Ishtar, and the story ends with this 1994 game, also known as The Destiny of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was the protagonist to this saga. So there haven't been any main stories since the game. There have been some side stories, but most interestingly, that the last one was a 2011 mobile game. But when I was buying these games, I did not realize that those are the same character. I bought the Tower of Druaga because that sounded cool, and I bought the Blue Crystal Rod because that sounded cool too, but I didn't know before researching that these games were connected. So it's very cool to get two pieces of the series. I don't remember seeing anything about the Return of Ishtar, the middle game in the series, but maybe at some point I'll come across it. Next is CB Charo Wars Ushina Wareta Gag. So Devilman is a manga that began in 1972 about a teenager whose body gets taken over by demons and fights other demons, but since his pure soul is stronger, that's kind of the idea. Body gets taken over by demons, but his pure soul is stronger. So Devilman also had an anime with some films, novels, and video games, but this game, Devilman appears in this 1992 side-scrolling beat-em-up, along with some of the other characters by the original manga's creators. So based on what I saw about Devilman, I could be totally wrong. This character on the front kind of looks like him. Maybe I'm horribly wrong, but that's kind of what I was understanding. The game was developed by Almanac and published by Banpresto, and I bought it because it looked cool, as most of the other games I'm buying. Next is a game we've talked about in the past, in both episodes so far. Chibi Maruko-chan on the Famicom, and we also had 3 Chibi Maruko-chan games on the Game Boy, and this one is also a Chibi Maruko-chan game. We have Chibi Maruko-chan Harakiri 365 Nichi no Maki. So we've talked about it, that Chibi Maruko-chan is a manga about a mischievous little girl that began long ago. And this is a 1991 board game developed by SAS Sakata and published by Epoch. And just based on gameplay, because that's all I was able to find, was that it kind of looked like Candyland. No idea if that's actually how it played, but that's what it looked like. And speaking of, in general, all the links to where I found this information and links to the gameplay can be found in the description. For all these videos, I'm going to try and make a Google Doc that has a list of all the links so that you can view the gameplay yourself, if you seem so interested. Why I bought it just kind of goes along with the fact that I saw a ton of Chibi Maruko-chan games, so I just went with it and bought a ton of them. Here we are. Next is Chao Maho Teriku Was, which is a 1995 RPG developed by Red and published by Bulletproof Software. You play as a hero or a heroine to save Waz, a land, from evil. The game is pretty much all magic, and instead of battling with just weapons, you can also battle with magic and ESP, and you make your own concoctions for things, which seems pretty interesting, that it seems like there's a lot of freedom there. So you travel through several continents with several very magical locations. Some of the ones I found that were interesting were Magic Cave, Fortune-telling Baba's house, and Balaam's flying air castle, just to name a few. So it never came to North America, but it did get a fan translation called The Magical Land of Waz, and that alone is kind of why I bought it. So if you don't notice from the intro, and you don't notice by the way I look, if you know me and you know I'm a huge Scott the Woz fan, and this game is titled, has Woz in the title. So that's exactly why I bought it. But still, seems pretty interesting. Next, another series we've talked about in the past. In episode 2, we talked about Crayon Shin-chan, a manga that began also long ago, just about a mischievous 5-year-old this time. So we have 2 games. We have Crayon Shin-chan Arashi o Yobu Enji, and also Crayon Shin-chan 2, Daimao no Gyakushu. So Arashi o Yobu Enji roughly translates to kindergartner calling Arashi, and Daimao no Gyakushu roughly translates to counterattack of the Great Demon King. Very different titles, and a very interesting title for a game about a 5-year-old. So we talked about Crayon Shin-Chan in the past. The first game is a 1993 platformer developed by Sun L and published by Bandai, where you travel all over town talking to people. And all else that I was able to find about it was that it was ported to the Mega Drive or the Genesis in 1994, only in Japan. But also, the second game is a 1994 platformer, also developed by Sun L and also published by Bandai. You again travel all over, but this time your main goal is to free a superhero from a prison. And what I noticed is that this game actually looked visually very good. It actually looked like an updated version of the first one. So I think there's maybe some interconnectedness between the games, but still very interesting. And this one looked very appealing for a Super Nintendo game, Super Famicom game. Next is Dear Boys. So Dear Boys I bought strictly based on the name because I thought that was a very funny title. But of course, I come to find out that it's a manga. So it's a 1989 manga about a high school basketball team and kind of goes and talks about the trials and tribulations of being teammates, trying to win a championship. But it had a ton of manga runs, like a lot. It had an anime, had 2 video games, the other one being a 2003 PS2 game. And this game specifically is a 1994 basketball sim developed by Cans and published by Yutaka, seemingly based on the manga. There was not a lot of information about this on the web, so seems kind of interesting. Next is Desert Fighter Sunan no Arashi Sakusen, or better known as ASP, Airstrike Patrol, here in North America. So it's a 1994 shoot-'em-up developed by Opus and published by Seta, loosely based on the Gulf War. My understanding is it's kind of like the Gulf War, but they changed the names of things so that it doesn't seem exactly like the Gulf War. It doesn't seem like it's trying to make a statement. But kind of like air management, you are managing parts of the war. You're managing airstrikes against 2 fictional countries. And again, kind of going back to how it is similar to air management, it's a sim and you have to manage resources and you have to manage the politics behind your airstrikes. So that seems kind of interesting. It would eventually come as ASP on the Super Nintendo in 1995, so only a year later. But the title Desert Fighter alone is kind of what brought it to me. Also, that label looks really neat. If you haven't noticed, I like just buying things that I think are cool. Next is Dino Wars Kyoryu Okoku no Daiboken. I think I said that right. Or just better known as Dino City here in North America. So it's a 1992 platformer developed by Smart Egg Pictures and published by Irem, and it's loosely based on the TV movie Adventures in Dinosaur City. Never heard of the movie, never seen it, don't know anything about it, but my understanding is that the art style for the game is fairly different for what the movie was. So you play as 2 kids who accidentally end up in prehistoric times, and you have to team up with a T-Rex and a Protoceratops to try and get the last component to get them back home. Which is apparently also the plot of the movie. So, like I said, brought to North America the same year, and just a game called Dino Wars. How could you go wrong? If anybody's ever actually seen that movie, please tell me. Next, another series we've talked about. On the first episode, we talked about Doraemon. Doraemon is just this absolutely humongous anime ambassador, as it was called in 2008. Started as a manga. It's super iconic. It began in 1969 about a robotic cat named Doraemon and a boy named Nobita. And it's kind of all the adventures of that. But we got 2 games for Doraemon. The first one is Doraemon Nobita Toyose no Kuni, or Doraemon Nobita and Fairy Country. The other one is Doraemon 2 Nobita no Toys Land Daiboken, or Doraemon 2 Nobita's Great Toys Land Adventure. So the first one, it's a 1993 action-adventure game developed by SAS, Sakata, and published by Epoch. And the second game is also a 1993 action-adventure game developed... Why didn't I just write that they're the same thing? Okay. They're both 1993 action-adventure games developed by SAS, Sakata, and published by Epoch. But the interesting part is that I was able to find walkthroughs for the game, but I couldn't find anything about the plot. So if I wanted to, I could have read the entire walkthrough, which was several pages long for each game, and gathered a plot for each game. And for the few seconds I talk about these games, I wasn't going to do that. But my understanding is from most of the stories in the Doraemon franchise, your goal is to save the kids, save Nobita and his friends. So that's kind of interesting. And kind of like what I was saying with Chibi Morocco-chan, I saw a bunch of Doraemon games. I'm actually kind of familiar with Doraemon in general, so it was just cool to get more games based on the franchise. I am running out of room on my desk. Next is Down the World, Merville's Ambition. So it's a 1994 RPG developed and published by ASCII. ASCII. Yeah, sure, something like that. There's a princess who sheds a bunch of tears, but she has a finite number of tears. And when the tears were gone, the world would end. So you play as a blue tear knight named Gao as he treks through 9 worlds to defeat Merville and save the world. Can't get much more JRPG than that. But interestingly, it was initially written to be a movie, and it was initially considered to be on the Super Famicom CD-ROM add-on, which never actually came out, but there was one planned. Kind of talked a little bit about the Famicom disk system. It's supposed to be an add-on for better games on the Super Famicom, but as cartridges got more powerful, they just decided to make it a cartridge. But the name Down the World sounded very interesting, and upon reading into it, pretty accurate for a JRPG. Next, we also talked about this game in the first episode. We talked about Dragon Slayer 4, which was the 4th game in that series. And now we're going to talk about Dragon Slayer Ayu Densetsu, better known as Dragon Slayer The Legend of Heroes. So there's a couple interesting things at play here. One, this is the 6th game in the Dragon Slayer series, but it's the first game in the Legend of Heroes series. So it was a crossover for 2 games. So we got Dragon Slayer, The Legend of Heroes 1 and 2, and then The Legend of Heroes broke off into its own series alone. There's a lot of games I never heard of in that series, but we'll stick to this game. But that became a whole separate series. The most recent one that I saw for The Legend of Heroes was released in 2022. So that's kind of interesting too. But this game is a 1989 RPG developed by Falcom and published by Epoch. And it was originally released for home computers. I couldn't find anything about the story, but there was a ton of walkthrough information on GameFAQs. And just in general, it looks like an RPG. So it received ports to a ton of other home computers. It got a 1994 port on the Mega Drive. That version got a Virtual Console Wii release in 2009. It also had ports to PS1 and Saturn in 1998. But most notably, the only way it came to North America was on the TurboGrafx CD in 1992. So I don't own any TurboGrafx games, period, for any of the Turbo systems. I have one friend that does collect, but that's the only way this game came over on the TurboGrafx CD, which is kind of interesting. I think, if I remember correctly, that Dragon Slayer 4 was Legacy of the Wizard, which actually seemed like a pretty interesting name. It seemed like a pretty interesting game, too, on the NES. So this is just a later game in that same series. Next. Oh, boy. Next is Dual Orb, which is just a pretty cool name. It's a 1993 turn-based RPG developed and published by IMAX. That's me. I am Max. Don't laugh. That wasn't funny. You play as the young Ralph as he quests through a world ruled by 2 dragons who split the world when human science advances too far. So I don't remember the 2 names of the 2 dragons. I didn't write them down. But basically, they ripped the world in half because they didn't really believe in human science. I was not able to find almost any gameplay, like whatsoever, and it was never released out of Japan. But what I do know, that in 1994 it got a sequel, and that sequel got a fan translation. So if that seems interesting to you, maybe you have to play the sequel first before you know what happens here. But Dual Orb also sounds like a pretty interesting game to begin with. Next is Alfaria. So this is also a 1993 turn-based RPG, this time developed by Red and published by Hudson. It's a little different from traditional RPGs. There's no money or experience points to be had, as most RPGs do have, but you find everything in open-world treasure chests. So if you want to get experience, you get them by opening treasure chests. If you want to get items, you find open-world treasure chests. And same thing with the bosses. You have to defeat the bosses to get things like experience. But otherwise, you don't get it from just regular battles. and all else that I was able to find about it was that it had a 1995 sequel. So pretty interesting. Last but not least, the last game for the episode is Contra Spirits, and I left it for last. There was no game that like super stood out to me as like a favorite game in this episode, but I am familiar that Contra is one of the most classic NES games. So this game is a 1992 run and gun developed and published by Konami, where you fight off aliens in 4 side-scrolling levels and 2 overhead levels. And I know I'm doing an injustice to the Contra series, but this game is the 3rd one in the Contra series. Contra for NES is like one of the most classic NES games, like I mentioned, almost like a must-play for the system. And this game actually is considered one of the greatest games of all time, which is saying a lot, because I don't know a lot about the Contra series. It was released in North America as Contra 3, The Alien Wars a few months later, and very interestingly, normally I wouldn't talk about its European releases, but the Europe release for this game was Super Probotector Alien Rebels in late 1992, which is kind of interesting. That's a very funny title. Later releases in Europe for the Contra series were under the name Contra. This game had a ton of ports. It had a Game Boy port in 1994, a Game Boy Advance port. That's not the right year. I put 1992. I think it was 2002. As Contra Hard Spirits in Japan and Contra Advanced The Alien Wars EX in North America. I wrote the wrong thing down. Oh well. But it was also brought to the Wii, Wii U, and 3DS virtual consoles all over the world. So there's a lot of different ways you could play this game. It was kind of unceremonious, but that's the end of the episode. So one thing to note before I close out is that things are starting to get busy around these parts. So I'm going to do my best to try and stick to having, one episode a week, but it might become a little more scattered just based on how busy things are being outside of the video game collecting world. So forgive me if episodes don't come out as quickly as or as frequently as they have been in the past 3 weeks. So otherwise, I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed talking. If you're still hanging out, thanks for being here, and hopefully see you next week.